IPv4 on IPv6.
Good morning. Jeff's always a tough act to follow, so I'm going to try a little bit, maybe a little bit different tact on this, although people are probably wondering, again, what are we doing talking about economics at the NANOG conference? And the short answer for me is I decided to take a little bit of time away from the industry and do some graduate work at Seattle University. So being in network engineering for a while and trying to blend the two had me thinking a lot about how could I try to help in this way by, combining what I was learning with what I knew. And since there's not a lot of literature or a lot of overall thought about how the economics underlie this, this is my attempt to try to bring light to an area that I think we need to think about a little bit more, at least on a basic level. So my goal for this talk for everyone here is that we at least just start thinking about how these principles sort of affect us, because they do affect us in pretty much everything we do. The money that flows around this industry is large, and it affects everything we do. And when we push against the economic principles behind it, it's really hard. If you're a single person or you're a small company and you can control all the inputs and outputs, then it can be a little bit easier. But when we're in this massive, highly competitive, very differentiated industry, pushing against the numbers is really hard. So a little bit of the brief history of how we got to the market for IPv4 addresses and dealing with scarcity. I think this is mostly a recap, but for a long time we've used need as our measure of who should get address space. And over time that became RFCs, and the RARs were formed, and the policies have changed and morphed over time, and we have 5 separate RARs now producing different policies, somewhat coordinated but largely independent in each of those regions. And coming toward the exhaustion that we saw coming up, we developed policies for the exhaustion period, for the transition period. And those, in basic understanding, was, well, we needed to have some sort of market to deal with the exhaustion phase, how to reallocate some portion of the resources to where they should go or might be best used. So the idea of a market was allowed, and we are starting that to allow some underlying economics to affect where address space goes in the post-exhaustion period. So what are the pros and cons of a market, just from a really simple perspective for IPv4? Well, the pros are, we're going to bring economic forces into the arena. We're going to let money decide where address space goes. Well, that has some possible benefits. It has the ability to put address spaces into organizations that are going to use them to generate services for people. The big con that I see from this area is that this has the potential to perhaps delay or maybe even deter V6 adoption. I think, as Jeff was talking about, if we don't think about how the market is going to affect us long-term in the transition, the market mindset that we'll just be able to solve our problems by using a market puts us into a position where we don't get the outcome that we desire. There's sort of also a caveat that chopping up into lots of little blocks has some consequences for network engineering. Lots of people talk about the routing table. How real a problem it is or isn't, well, when we get to it, we'll have to figure it out, I guess. But there is consequences to chopping things up into little blocks. So what do we know about the IPv4 market to date? Well, there's one very large, well-known transaction that came out of the Nortel bankruptcy. Microsoft paid $7.5 million for 667,000 addresses, $11.25 per address. Aaron yesterday released the list of all of the address blocks that have been transferred under its directed services or directed transfer policy, and I did some adding up last night in the hotel trying to figure out what blocks went where. And from my math, there's about 3/16s in addition to the Microsoft transaction that have been traded since the directed transfer policy went into effect. So not a lot of spaces moved around, but some spaces moved around. So what's happening in the market? Well, there's address brokers that are forming. There's a couple of companies that see a potential commercial opportunity here. And on this slide, there's one of them who has graciously decided to list their bid and ask prices on the front page of their website. And as you can see here, I have no way to verify if these are actual bids or actual offers, but if they're posting it publicly, it would seem that they're probably pretty serious about what these prices are underlying. So what about demand from an economic perspective? Well, this is the history of how much address space we've been consuming over the past 15 years. Yes, it's up and to the right. We are using more address space every year, and we've been doing it for a long time. And it's based on what we know, it's probably going to continue in that way. And you can see here the Asia-Pacific region has really been driving the usage of address space in the past 5 years. Well, one day I was thinking about that last chart and thinking about, what underlying effects are in the marketplace. So I pulled some GDP numbers out, and I graphed it against that. You take the annual rates and graph them against world GDP. And you got something that was, well, up and to the right a little bit, and somewhat correlated. So to some extent, this makes sense, right? People are getting more services, more mobile devices are going out there, more address spaces. Basically, from my perspective, what does this mean? It means as we get richer as people, we're going to need more address space. And that's not going to change over time. So what about deployment incentives? Well, here's my bar chart of what it costs to deploy IPv4 and what it costs to deploy IPv6. And for this, I took 5 categories: reliability, what the hardware and software costs, people, training, support, and the address space, since we're talking about IP address markets. So in every one of these categories except for address space, I believe the cost to deploy IPv6 today is much larger than IPv4. And so what is that telling us? It's telling us that we have to go beyond that if we want to look at how we can put IPv6 out there. Now, in some of the economic literature, there's a gentleman called Harold Hotelling who did some work in the 1930s about exhaustible resources, and specifically he was looking at oil reserves. And his postulate was that we wouldn't transition to a new technology or a new resource until the cost of the old resource exceeded the cost of the new resource. So what does that look like in terms of IPv4 and IPv6? So this is a graph showing IPv4 and IPv6 over time. And just for illustrative purposes, we started with IPv6 being twice as expensive as IPv4. And over time, 10 years, 10% down for IPv6 and 10% up for IPv4. This is sort of like a best case scenario, in my opinion, that IPv6 becomes into its being, it becomes cheaper over time, and IPv4 becomes more expensive. It becomes less desirable for people. And that can help us move forward into a world where IPv6 is allowed to be a big part of the one network that we want to see. So what are some other things in terms of economic principles? Well, there's a lot of talk about substitutes in some of the economic literature. And a substitute is something that you would choose one over the other. The best well-known one in sort of common literature or common practice would be Coke or Pepsi, and taking your personal preference aside, they're a beverage of choice. So if we look at that for IPv4 and IPv6, today IPv6 is not a perfect substitute. It's more expensive. It doesn't do the same thing. And you can't really talk between the two networks without the transition technologies. Another element in there is what's called a network effect. And network effect is basically the more people that you have on one network, the more valuable it is. The more people on Facebook makes Facebook more valuable to each individual person. If you're on Joe's social network, it's not very valuable because there's only 6 of you there. So all of us are on v4 right now, and IPv6 is largely a green field, so it's not as valuable. There's a network effect going on there that is making v4 seem more valuable than it is, and in order to push toward v6, we have to look at sort of how that goes underneath those. And the other big elephant in the room, of course, is NAT, and we've talked a lot about that in terms of carrier-grade NAT and how that might impact our world. But unfortunately, from an economic perspective, NAT is a pretty good substitute for IPv4 at small scale. And we've seen this in the home environment for a long time. You know, we could have been allocating v4 addresses to TVs and all sorts of things in the home for years, and policy even permits this. But we haven't done that. We've chosen to use the CPE model where we do NAT and behind a single address that allows us to share one address per household. So what about the market itself? What are the dynamics? Well, first of all, the IPv4 market is never going to be perfect competition. It's never going to be that perfect supply and demand graph because there are switching and transfer costs. The supply in the market is limited. We have to continue to operate our networks as they are. There's some efficiency we can pull out, but there's not an available large supply from what we can see. And as we looked at earlier, demand is continuing to grow, so demand is continuing to increase even in the background. So this is a really complicated chart, but I was trying to illustrate something about efficiency here. So at the top left-hand corner, you can see the RIR runouts in the pink and the red, and we sort of get to that for simplicity purposes in 2012 for this graph. And then I was saying to myself, well, we've not totally used up every address space if we got to exhaustion. There's some efficiency that we can get in terms of, you know, there's some address space in the corner that's not being well used, or we found some over there that we could put somewhere else in a better way. So if you say we're about 70% efficient in 2012, that leaves us with the brown line, which is about 850 million addresses that are sort of available but locked up in existing organizations. And if we drew that down over time, how long would it take for us to do that at the current growth and demand curve that we've been seeing? And well, that takes us to about 2016 before we've gone from a 70% efficiency utilization to 100% utilization. So then we have the purple-blue that moves up and to the right. That's sort of, well, after we run out of v4, we got to put that onto v6. So that's the number of addresses that we deploy in v6 after we run out of this 100% efficient v4. And lastly on this chart, there's this kind of light blue line that starts at about 2015 and moves up to the right. That's what would happen if you use this model to show how many v6 addresses get put in as a percentage of v4 addresses if you use the same demand numbers, meaning about 250 million addresses this year and growing at about 10% per year. So that says that in about 2020 or 2021, 50% of all addresses in use on the internet would have to be IPv6 if we let the current demand numbers continue. So one other area of economics is called game theory, and game theory is about how organizations make choices in their environment, and perhaps that can help us understand a little bit about what's going on in our industry. And one of the common games that you talk about is a coordination game. In terms, there are different payouts for different organizations depending on what choices they make. In our industry, it might be interesting to look at in terms of what would happen if you adopted a specific protocol. And if you think about this in terms of, am I going to adopt 6RD or dual stack light or something like that? And these are commonly written in this 4x4 matrix where you have these outcomes. And on this slide, the blue represents a competitor A and B represents a competitor B, and the red represents competitor B. And there are different outcomes in terms of profit that occur based upon what different competitors choose. And in this case, if both adopted protocol B, that would be better for everyone. But if one chose to adopt one and the other chose to adopt a different protocol, it would be worse for both of them. And so in some ways I see this as sort of a problem with the V6 transition because we don't sort of have a clear path forward in terms of technology for transition. You know, there's too many options. What are we doing? What is the plan that we have? You know, in terms of, could we all agree in some way that one was the best way forward? I know that's hard in a competitive environment, but maybe that's the best way. The problem with standards is that there's too many to choose from. And in this case, I think that's true. We need to figure out how we can coalesce toward a plan that produces a possible outcome that's good for everyone. And perhaps we're delaying adoption because we can't come out with a plan that everyone seems to find palatable from a long-term perspective. And in other ways, we look at the idea of an economic commitment. And this is just a side topic, but if a large provider was to basically say, I'm going to choose this as my method of transition, that perhaps would be a way to move the industry forward. If a large provider chose to adopt one protocol as a transition, it may have the effect of getting everybody on the bandwagon and moving toward a single destination. So lastly, 3 hypotheses about what could happen here in terms of from an economic perspective. So one could say large-scale adoption of V6 won't occur until the V4 exhaustion is complete. Well, this almost seems inevitable at this point given where we are, but this would be an application of the scarce resource rundown model. Finally, number 2, the transfer prices in different regions are going to vary due to different rules, different supply and demand, and different restrictions. And interregional transfers could change this, could affect the marketplace, but this has the possibility of affecting the transfer price market. Third, how much is an IP address worth? So you could do some modeling. I did a little bit. A couple models that I came up with show the price to be about $150 to $1,100 US per IP address. There's a paper link at the end of the slide deck that you can figure out how I got those numbers. But this is using a IP address in a manner that is required to be unique, such as hosting or some sort of specific uniqueness requirement. So what's the conclusions real quick? Economics are part of our life, so we should be aware of how they're affecting us and how we can deal with this situation. Just understanding it can help us make better decisions overall in the long term. And economics can change over time too. I think that's possible. When the rules change in the game, we can change our environment and perhaps turn the economics toward our advantage. So looking at what we can do as engineers, operators, policymakers to change the underlying infrastructure and the underlying cost models can benefit our industry by allowing us to promote the adoption of V6 and potentially get ourselves out of this situation we're in. So so I'll take some questions if you have any.
Hello, David Farmer, University of Minnesota. I like the fact that you're focusing on economics, but you seem to be focusing on cost, and that's not the only economic factor. In enterprise networks or other kinds of networks, cost, I call them cost-centered networks, that is a dominant factor. However, in service providers or open or public networks, revenue, in other words, what you get paid for, is also a factor. Now, they work together, but in our society and in the business, cost sometimes isn't even the dominant factor, sometimes revenue is. And so how does that play into all of what's your economic model?
So I would say economic cost, of course, is the dollars, but it's also opportunity cost. So there's the non-dollar component of that as well. In terms of revenue, I think we are in an area where revenue is really restricted, and that does have an effect on how you could model some of these things out. I didn't specifically spend a lot of time looking at that from a long-term perspective, but it could be interesting to look at how we could change perhaps the ability to move things forward if the revenue models were different. And the cost, the way we were able to produce enough revenue to offset the cost of the transition.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.